flash forward, I already made the frame and started to place the clay post filling everything in with the aluminum foil, but it looks like this on the inside for reference if you want to know what the frame looks like. After filling the frame with aluminum foil and starting the base layer of air dry clay on the jaws, upper and lower, I'm going to start to sculpt in little V-lines into the muzzle and start to make some nice little preemptive snarls. I do have a paintbrush that I'm kind of using and setting aside to make a point to use to smooth out my clay. It will kind of clog in your bristles, and I just like to have one designated brush to help smooth out my clay and even it out on my aluminum surface. That being said, the initial layer of air dry clay is the sole purpose of just smoothing out the framework that we've made and allowing us to sculpt in later and add additional muscling, kind of give it further expression. But right now we need to lock in on making everything nice and smooth and hide all of that aluminum foil, every last tiny little shiny little ball. I will say this step mostly focuses in on that smoothing, but I do preemptively add a few chunks of snarl line clay as I'm looking at my references, just to have that base already set and kind of firm. That being said, I do want to talk about a little bit of the eye placement. So I'm going to go ahead and use a symmetrical method of placement. So I'm going to take both of my beads and place them into the air dry clay at the same time to try to prevent asymmetry as much as possible. And I'm going to do this twice because our Fae Wolf has 4 eyes. So I'm going to repeat this step and continue to kind of measure it out. This was my second time attempting that method, and I do have to say I found that it really helped, so I do recommend it. If asymmetry tends to be an issue for you and your sculptures, I would say just place the stuff at the same time with both hands and see how it goes. Once I confirm the eye placement, I use a V-shaped piece of clay, and I use that to make our initial sockets, and I'll sculpt that back and kind of use that to anchor our beads in place. And then I take a larger chunk of clay and I'll use that to make kind of the full remnant socket, and that'll really confirm the 2 eyes on each side of the head. And then I use that to sculpt back and form our temples, our nape of the neck, so on and so forth, kind of cascading down the bust of the sculpt, if you will. As you may be able to tell, I do have a decent amount of cracks on the bust of our sculpture. That being said, it's not all lost. We are going to be able to repair this, but our bust is looking a little bit busted, so let's go ahead and repair those cracks before we do anything further in our sculpture. That being said, above in the corner here is my recipe for my crack clay fix, and I'm gonna go ahead and pack that into the grooves of the sculpture and allow that to dry for a full 24 hours. But in the meantime, that does give us time to work on other aspects of the sculpture, like our teeth. I did make a whole bunch of teeth to give us a variety of shapes and sizes to work on, starting with aluminum base to kind of fill it in and give us less clay to wrap around. I let that clay kind of wrap and dry. That took less than 3 hours, and I could start to paint it. I used temperas in tan and yellow to do so. In my initial concept art of this piece, I did have some antlers in mind for it, and I did find a lot of lessons in it, so I do want to talk about it in this tutorial because here's the base and here's how I did it. That being said, I filled it in with our foil and then I wrapped it in our air dry clay and let it dry. Now let me show you how I got into really cool textures. So I made really micro balls of air dry clay, and I coated the now base dried clay version of the antlers in our Mod Podge, and then I layered little beads of clay and flattened those, and I kind of cascaded them upwards across the branches of the antlers to give it a little more of a almost ombre with texture. I also made a tongue off camera, and I did that just making a little sheet of aluminum foil and wrapping that in clay as well, and that one was quite easy, did not take me long at all. And yeah, so I did the tongue like that, and then I made a little clay block to help support the tongue and kind of give it a lift in the mouth so you can see it through the teeth. That was the goal, and I think it worked out pretty well, and I did that with just some leftover clay from the texturing from the antlers that day. In the paint process, I browned the gums of the teeth using a little bit of raw umber, and I filled in the tongue using a lot of mauves in my palette and a lot of pastels to kind of give it more veining as well. With all of our tiny mouth things painted and our antlers drying, it's time for a little update before we start the full paint process. So here we go. It looks really official, kind of like a taxidermy bust in my opinion. Y'all peep the little schnoot. Anyway, back to the paint process. In lining the pearl bead eyes, I've realized I wanted the skin to have a very kind of steely undertone and be very, very gray heavy. We are going to use a very dark fur for the coat, but I still want to have that skin detail underlying in case any patches are a little thinner, and just preemptively have that. So we're going to have a fully painted Fae Wolf skin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bada bing, bada boom, whoa! With the skin completely painted on, it was the quickest part of the process. Now we're able to focus on those really cool lilac eyes, so let's talk about that. With the eyes, I knew I wanted to avoid all dark colors, and I opted for a lilac because I wanted a really glowy kind of reflective look, but nothing really, really scary, so I felt like lilac was a very calm color to go with. I'm going to use chrome lavender in the pupil, and then for the veins, I'm also going to take that lavender and continue to kind of float it through the back of the eye. At this point, it was a layering game between the pastel lilac and allowing the lighter layers in the center of the eye to cure a little bit more before I could focus in on the pupil. But look at that! All of our patience is actually paid off. Now that we have the main part of the sculpture basically done, it's time to start fitting our ears. I did try to film these, but I lost the footage, so we're gonna go ahead and fit these. I painted them at the same time that we did the skin, and I sculpted it at the same time we did the tongue, so I don't know what happened, I'm sorry. After painting veining in the same method that I did with the eyes, I'm sealing in the ears with a very thin layer of Mod Podge to give it a mild gloss on the inside of the ear. We are going to be putting ear fluff into it, but I just wanted to have that detail. Do you remember all those tiny teeth? Because I do. It is going to be time to do our Fae Wolf dental, so let's get into it. I found that the easiest way to get these to stick was hot glue. I tried super glue, I tried Mod Podge too. Nothing seemed to work but hot glue. I tried tweezers, that didn't work, so I ended up using my fingers and I got a good amount of hot glue burns, but worth it for these fangs. In the gluing process, I also found it easier to rapid cool the hot glue with a little bit of ice water to help it quick cure and be able to move on to each tooth a little quicker, seeing as we had a lot to place and I wasn't sure how many would be able to fit, so I had made about 30 total. And I gave myself lots of size variety, and we were able to put 19 into his mouth. He looks great and snaggly. I learned so much about fur and fur placement with this Fae Wolf, so I'm going to show you a little bit what I learned and some things to note before you start to place fur on your piece. Some things to know are what to identify from your references. Your texture, your volume, and your color of your fur are going to be very critical to note. That being said, try to find an exact match if you can. Some furs are expensive. I got mine at the craft store for like $2 though. Another thing is fur direction. Focusing down the center of the face, I follow the fur into the eye sockets and notice that the fur kind of repels away from the eyes in opposing directions, so I keep that in mind while I'm going to start to place the fur. Another thing I look at is the general bust and anatomy of that section of the animal's face to kind of follow continual fur flow. Now, this project so far has taken me, at this point, 3 months to do because it just takes a lot of time, and the fur was honestly the longest part. 1, because I couldn't find the fur that I'd wanted, and 2, because it's just a lot of very, very tiny squares, like 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch squares that I'm gluing across this bust. So I'm taking it kind of row by row, section by section, starting with bigger squares at the chest. I do regret that. I wish I would have stayed to the uniform smaller squares to add volume to the coat. So take after my mistakes and learn from them ahead of time. And then I just kind of rotate the sculpture and continue to build the fur line up, making sure to continue to brush each stroke and each square of fur and make sure that it's in the proper direction before I lay it down. Also, another thing that you might notice is I'm putting Mod Podge not just on the fabric square, but also on the sculpture, so I kind of have a two-way layer of Mod Podge in between the fabric and the skin of the sculpt, so that it's for sure very firm in place. I do not want the stuff to slough off or move, and I gave it plenty of time to cure before I started messing with each section. I'm also using a paintbrush to roll the corners of my fabric squares into the statue and into the other corners of fur just to make sure everything is nice and blended. So I'm just using the opposite end, the wooded end of my paintbrush to do so. Now that our Fae Wolf is giving more of a Shinzi energy, we are good to continue our process. I just wanted to give y'all a quick update. This is my last time trying the antlers and I didn't like them, so we're just gonna go with an antlerless Fae Wolf for this project. This is furring day 2. Now we're getting more into the tight-knit corners of the face, the lower jaws, and into the ear areas. How exciting! Now, don't say I didn't warn you about this being a repetitive process. I wasn't kidding when all I said is we're gluing and painting and gluing and painting and painting and gluing and gluing and painting all of her fur, all over every crevice of our Fae Wolf up until the face. At this point, I started to build the hair from the forehead and then descending down towards the snoot. And that's how I started to place my fur, still keeping in mind my references and the flow of direction of the fur from the eye sockets and the jaw, and just making sure that all the fur is flowing away from the eyes, away from the face, as I'm gluing it in the opposite direction. Narrowing in underneath the second layer of eyeball, under the additional eyeballs, we're going to start to lay our bits of fabric underneath the eye socket, starting to flow towards the ears, away from the eyes and away from the snoot, and continue to cascade that fur coat down, brushing every couple of squares as I do so, just to blend the fur back into the initial coat that we've made. What I do to one side, I also do to the other to continue to keep symmetry, especially with the fur flow and fur volume. I don't want one side to be thinner than the other, so every time I work on one socket, I work on the opposing socket on the other side of the face, just to maintain some symmetry there. I just want to give a huge thank you and shout out to those of you who've watched us work on this project live on Twitch. It was so much fun to work on this project, even though it was one of those long-term goals, and I think it turned out really, really cool. So thank you so much to everyone who came through and watched the progress as it was happening live. And if you want to see what else we have in the works on our Twitch, feel free to check it out at Faded Alien on Twitch for all of our other really, really cool, chaotic, colorful projects coming very soon. Commencing placement of the ear fluffs here in a second. I start at the base of the ears and then work my way up to the tips and then around the perimeter of the outer ear where the outer ear fluff meets the inner ear skin. So I start to progressively build those up and I start making tips of triangles towards the top of the ear instead of squares, just so it's a little more compatible with the ear tip. Also worked really hard to hide that tiny piece of aluminum that you see in the top corner. That was just a little bit of the exposed sculpture, but problems resolved. We got that all good and covered with paint and floof. Once I hit that little rectangular perimeter of the outer ear, I started to cut the fabric into little thin strips of fur and started to almost glue that like a border around the ear to create a little more of a better blend between the fake skin and the fluff. With all the fabric squares used and done for the most part, I'm now going to take any pieces of loose fluff and I'm going to use that to hand flock any of the last bits of fur that I may have to better blend the fabric squares to the skin on the face. So I'm starting to take tiny little clusters of hair and kind of pin that into the clay using the Mod Podge as like a little sticky adhesive layer, and I'm just laying those hairs down layer by layer and using the Mod Podge to seal them in. After allowing the fabric to fully dry to the sculpture, I then took my scissors and made tiny little tapers in the fur from the chin, the eyes, and the ears just to clear away extra fluff, and then we had our completed Fae Wolf. You guys, he looks stunning. I love everything about him. Thank you so much for staying for the full tutorial. I hope you guys found it somewhat enlightening. If you want to see what I'm doing when I'm not here on YouTube, I do also have my Twitch where I'm working on my art almost all the time, so be sure to see what we have in store. Thank you so much, friends, for coming along. I cannot wait to show you our next project. Just a little hint, it's a little spooky. I love you guys so much. Remember to stay safe, stay positive, and stay creative. Bye, friends. I'll see you next time.